Hello everybody and welcome to Project Trade. This is our biographical series on the life and times of the chairs of the Federal Reserve. Daniel Crissinger, the first head of the Federal Reserve to not be born during the US Civil War, was born 1 year before the Civil War started on December the 10th, 1860 in Marion County, Ohio. From what we know, he was also the first Federal Reserve head to be born inside a log cabin. Things would only get better for him though. Crissinger was raised with the Reconstruction and Gilded Age of America all around him. Business was good, and Ohio was a central part in the Great Expansion. Industrialist Benjamin Goodrich created his rubber and tire manufacturing company there in 1870. John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in Cleveland in 1872, and in the same year the American Financial Group was established there as well. After completing his studies at Caledonia High School at the age of 20, Crissinger attended Buckdale College in Akron and then studied law at the University of Cincinnati, where he would graduate in 1886. While studying, Crissinger had already been working at the state court with William Davis, a US Civil War Union veteran turned lawyer who would go on to serve as a judge in the Ohio Supreme Court. Crissinger gained most of his early experience with Davis and would begin to work his way up the ladder of the legal profession. In 1893, he was elected as the city solicitor of Marion, Ohio, where he would attempt to fight off civil lawsuits coming against the city, serving in the position for 3 terms. This helped propel Crissinger's reputation in the legal field as well as giving him an extensive network of contacts throughout Marion. Crissinger would then cross over into the banking sector and was given the role of vice president of the City National Bank of Marion at the time of its founding. He would go on to become president of that bank in 1911, and throughout this time period, Crissinger served on the boards of numerous companies such as the Marion Steam Shovel Company, the Marion County Telephone Company, the Marion Packing Company. He was even the president of the Marion Cemetery Association. This was a man who was all things Marion, Ohio, a finger in every single pie. The combination of his legal, banking, and business experience did make Crissinger a target for the administration of Warren G. Harding, who had won the presidency and took office in March of 1921. It surely helped that Crissinger and Harding were friends and former neighbors back in Ohio. Harding nominated Crissinger to become the 14th Comptroller of the currency, and Crissinger took up the post. As Comptroller of the currency, Crissinger was charged with executing the legislation which applied to national banks. The office needed to ensure that these banks were operating legally with the aim of creating a safer and steadier banking environment. The position also came with a seat on the Federal Reserve Board, which Crissinger would sit in for the first time. At the same time as Crissinger was appointed Comptroller of the currency, one Andrew Mellon was appointed as the Treasury Secretary. That is Andrew Mellon from the Mellon family of Mellon Financial, the large investment banking firm who would go on to merge with the Bank of New York in 2007 to form BNY Mellon. When Andrew Mellon took up the post as Treasury Secretary, he quickly got to work enacting tax cuts, which he argued were necessary for widespread economic growth across the country. His first Revenue Act was passed after just 8 months and would see the repeal of the wartime excess profits tax. This tax had been in place to ensure that a higher tax burden was placed on any business whose operations thrived under the conditions of the First World War. Further to this, the income tax rate for the country's highest earners was slashed and the 3 highest brackets were removed entirely. In fact, almost every single income tax tier saw a reduction. The cuts made in this bill would be one of the first major building blocks on what came to be known as the Roaring Twenties. The protagonist of this piece, Daniel Crissinger, he would be a staple in the management of the US economy throughout this period. Having been pleased with his work as currency comptroller, after the term of then Federal Reserve Chair William Harding expired, President Warren G. Harding turned to his former neighbor once more, and on May the 1st, 1923, Crissinger would become the 3rd chairman of the Federal Reserve. Sudden tragedy would occur only 3 months later though, as President Harding would die of a heart attack. He would be succeeded by then Vice President Calvin Coolidge. Andrew Mellon would retain his position as Treasury Secretary under Coolidge, and another Revenue Act in 1924 would see further tax cuts passed. Named the Mellon Tax Bill after the man himself, federal income tax was again cut at all levels. After just 2 Revenue Acts, the highest tax bracket rate had fallen from 73% to 58% and now to 46%. You cannot believe that Andrew Mellon was done yet though. The next Revenue Act of 1926 slashed income tax again, now pushing the top tax bracket down to only 25%. inheritance tax was cut, and the gift tax was eliminated as well. It should come as no surprise that Andrew Icarus Mellon was viewed as extremely influential within the Coolidge administration. At the time, Mellon's policies were backed up with results though. There was a growth in GDP, a reduction in the national debt, interest rates were able to be set at a relatively low rate for the time at around 5%, inflation fluctuated steadily between minor amounts of inflationary pressure and minor amounts of deflationary pressure, unemployment was reduced and hovered around 4 or 5%. From all the evidence provided, the economy was strong. Meanwhile, a significant piece of legislation which had been building up regarding the Federal Reserve was passed in 1927. As the Federal Reserve had thus far proven to be a relative success story, the aim of the act was to further entrench the Federal Reserve into the national system so as to bolster the perceived economic strength of the US monetary and financial systems. The Mcfadden Act, named after the anti-Semitic representative Lewis Thomas Mcfadden, rechartered the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks as their authority was initially limited to 20 years. This meant that the powers of the regional banks were not in fact due to expire until 1934, but there was substantial concern that the banks may not end up being rechartered, as this had occurred to the first and second United States banks in the 19th century. There was large support for ensuring the renewal, and when the Mcfadden Act passed, the regional banks were not only renewed 7 years earlier than initially mandated, but this time they would be rechartered in perpetuity. The Act also gave national banks the power to have as many branches as they wanted to, so long as it was permitted by the state that they were headquartered in. Interstate banking was prohibited by the Act, so a bank could not set up branches in multiple states, and so they would be tied to the legislation of the state that they were based in. There was some criticism against this decision, as it was argued that banks became less protected against localized downturns. If a bank was permitted to operate in multiple states, they would become more diversified and by doing so, therefore, have greater protection from those more regional economic problems which could occur. The rules forbidding interstate banking would eventually be repealed in the Regal-Neal Interstate Banking and Branching Efficiency Act, signed into law by Democratic President Bill Clinton in 1994, which in turn would see the rise of nationwide banking. The Mcfadden Act also relaxed restrictions on the nationally chartered member banks. As they had been governed by both state and national law, the member banks had an increased regulatory burden over them. This had led to difficulties for them in competing against non-member banks who only had to abide by state laws. For example, member banks under the national law were required to hold larger financial reserves than non-member banks and could thus loan out and invest less money. Instead of bringing up the regulatory requirements of the non-member banks, the Mcfadden Act brought the regulation of the member banks down towards those of non-member banks. So taxes were getting lower, interest rates were getting lower, and now with the Mcfadden Act, banking regulation standards were also getting lower. A recipe for what we now can see was quickly becoming an overheated economy as the roaring 20s reached their apex. But only a few months after the Mcfadden Act passed, Daniel Crissinger's term would end and he would finish his role as chair of the Federal Reserve on September the 15th, 1927. Crissinger's run as chair was at a time where the position still gave way to the dominant role of Treasury Secretary, and it was Mellon's economic policies which defined the time that Crissinger served as chair. Nevertheless, Crissinger was still a heavy influence in helping to implement that legislation during a time of great economic expansion in the United States. And when the sun shines, everybody's smiling. Only one Federal Reserve board member left during Crissinger's term as chair, so he really got to enjoy the economic fair weather of the age without having the obligation to try to tackle the rather large thunderstorm which was beginning to appear on the horizons of the US economy. Daniel Crissinger lived for another 15 years after finishing as chair of the Federal Reserve. He passed away on July the 12th, 1942 at the age of 81 in his beloved Marion, Ohio. Thank you for being here. If you do want more information, as always, that can be found in the video description because the video has reached its end.